Before the world learned to fear darkness, it belonged entirely to light. Fields stretched without interruption, painted in greens and golds that shifted with the breath of the earth itself. Rivers moved like living veins through valleys untouched by decay. Every living thing seemed to exist in agreement with something unseen, an order so natural it did not need to be questioned. And within that world walked Persephone. She was not yet a symbol of anything beyond herself, not yet a queen, not yet a prisoner of fate, only the daughter of Demeter, and in that identity alone, she was already part of something larger than she understood. Demeter did not simply rule over harvests. She was the rhythm of growth itself. Wherever she walked, life responded. Seeds obeyed her presence. Soil recognized her touch. The world bent gently toward her without resistance, as if grateful for the order she carried within her being. Persephone lived within that order like a quiet extension of it. But even in perfection, there is always a boundary waiting to be noticed. It was in the small moments that the shift began, moments too ordinary to feel important at the time. A pause in conversation where Demeter's attention lingered elsewhere. A breeze that carried pollen farther than usual, beyond familiar fields. A silence in nature that felt less like peace and more like distance. Persephone did not question these things. Not yet. The world above was too full of life to suggest absence. Everything bloomed. Everything returned. Nothing stayed broken long enough to feel permanent. But permanence was never the promise of this world. Only cycle. And cycles, by their nature, always contain the possibility of disruption. There were places Persephone was not yet allowed to go. Not by force, but by unspoken protection. Groves where even the wind seemed quieter. Meadows where flowers grew in patterns that felt older than language. Demeter watched over her daughter with a devotion that bordered on containment. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because Demeter, more than anyone, understood what it meant when life was taken out of balance. Still, Persephone was not a figure meant for stillness. She moved through the world with curiosity that did not yet understand consequence. She spoke to flowers as if they could answer. She lingered too long near edges of forests where light behaved differently. She asked questions that had no urgency, but hinted at distance. What lies beyond the fields? What exists where growth stops? Demeter would answer gently, always carefully, as though language itself could shape safety. Beyond, she would say, is only absence of what you know. But absence is not a warning that satisfies curiosity. It is a door that invites imagining. And imagination, once awakened, does not remain obedient. There are forces in the world above that even gods must respect. Not because they are stronger, but because they are older than explanation. One of those forces was change itself. The quiet certainty that nothing, no matter how perfect, remains untouched forever. And somewhere beyond the visible world, beneath what mortals called earth and silence, something else existed entirely. A domain not built from growth, but from what growth leaves behind. a place without seasons, without warmth, without decay that could end, because nothing there was ever meant to return. It was not yet part of Persephone's story, not yet part of her understanding. But myths do not begin at the moment they are noticed. They begin long before, in the space where everything still appears stable, where nothing has yet broken, and where the world, unaware of its own turning point, continues to bloom as if it will always remain that way. There are places in existence that do not participate in time. They exist beside it, not within it. And beneath the world of growth and light, there lies such a place where nothing blooms because nothing is permitted to fade. It is here that Hades rules, not as a tyrant, not as a conqueror, but as something closer to inevitability made conscious. The underworld does not shift with seasons. It does not respond to emotion. It does not bend toward hope or despair. It simply is, held together by laws older than desire. Hades does not decorate his domain with illusion. There is no need. Every path, every hall, every silence is exact. Nothing is accidental because nothing is allowed to be uncertain. And within that certainty, he remains alone in a way that cannot be softened by companionship. Not because he lacks presence, but because everything present is already final. Above him, the world of the living continues its endless cycle of becoming. Below him, everything is already what it will forever be. And between those two realms, there is no bridge that time can cross. Yet even in a place defined by stillness, there are moments when something from above is felt, not as intrusion, but as contrast. Hades first becomes aware of it not as an event, but as imbalance. A subtle disruption in the pattern of existence. Life, in its endless repetition of growth and decay, carries a rhythm that even the underworld can perceive, and that rhythm had begun to shift in a way that did not belong to his domain. It was not noise. It was not movement. It was something more unsettling. Change. And change, in a place that does not allow it, feels like a question without answer. Above, unaware of what has begun to stir beneath her world, Persephone continues to exist within light. She does not know she is being noticed. Not in the way mortals are noticed by other mortals, but in the way systems notice disruption. There is a moment, often overlooked in myth, where attention shifts without action, where observation precedes intention, where awareness becomes focus. This is that moment. Hades does not act. He observes. And in that observation, something unfamiliar begins to form. Not desire in the mortal sense, not longing as humans understand it, but recognition of something that does not belong in his realm, and therefore must be understood. Because in the underworld, everything that arrives is eventually accounted for, even questions, especially questions. Meanwhile, life above remains unaware of this gaze. Persephone walks through fields where flowers open as she passes, not because she commands them, but because the world responds naturally to her presence. There is no contradiction in her existence yet, no fracture, no separation. She is still part of the surface world in the most complete sense. And that completeness is fragile precisely because it has never been tested. Far below, Hades continues to listen to the structure of his domain. Every soul that arrives adds no chaos, only record. Every moment is absorbed into permanence. There is no surprise in death, only arrival. But what he senses now is not arrival. It is something unfinished, something still becoming. And that is what disturbs the order, not because it threatens it, but because it does not belong to it at all. In the world above, Demeter remains unaware of this subtle shift beneath existence. Her attention is fixed on growth, on continuity, on the fragile balance that keeps life from collapsing into absence. She does not look downward. She does not need to. Yet even she, goddess of harvest and cycle, understands somewhere beneath thought that balance is not guaranteed. It is maintained. And anything maintained can be interrupted. Still, Persephone remains untouched by this awareness. She is still within the world that believes itself whole. But myths do not announce when they begin to fracture. They simply allow the fracture to exist unnoticed until the moment it cannot be ignored. And somewhere far below, in the silence that does not echo, Hades continues to watch without moving, not yet acting, not yet revealing intention, only observing the shape of something that does not belong to his world, and beginning, for the first time, to define it. There are moments in history where nothing appears to happen, and yet everything has already begun. On the surface of the world, where light still ruled without question, Persephone wandered farther than she ever had before. Not because she was lost, but because the world had begun to feel larger than the boundaries she had been taught to respect. The fields were still familiar. The flowers still bloomed with obedient rhythm. The wind still carried the scent of growth and living soil. And yet, something subtle had changed. The edges of her world no longer felt like certainty. They felt like invitation. Far from the watchful presence of Demeter, Persephone stepped into a meadow that was not marked on any path. The flowers here were different, not in color or shape, but in the way they seemed to exist for no reason other than being seen. As if they were waiting. The air itself felt quieter, not in absence of sound, but in removal of expectation. Even the sunlight seemed less like protection and more like observation. Persephone did not notice the strangeness at first. Beauty has a way of disguising warning. She knelt among the flowers, touching them lightly, as though they might respond. And for a brief moment, the world above felt infinite in a way she had never experienced before. Not bounded by familiar fields, not contained by known paths, only openness. And openness, when unfamiliar, becomes dangerous not because it is hostile, but because it invites further step. Deep beneath this moment, far below where roots could ever reach, something shifted again. Not movement, not arrival, recognition. Hades, who ruled a world without change, felt the disturbance sharpen into clarity. The imbalance he had sensed before now had form. Not as threat, not as invasion, but as presence aligned with possibility. Something above was no longer simply existing. It was nearing a threshold. And thresholds, in the order of the world, are never accidental. They are approached, whether knowingly or not. Above, Persephone rose slowly, turning slightly as if she had heard something without sound. The meadow was still, too still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain whether it should continue. That was the first moment the world above began to feel less like home, and more like a space that could end. But she did not leave, because nothing had yet told her to fear it. And in mythology, that is always the most fragile moment of all. Below, in the silence that governs everything that cannot be undone, Hades stood, not moving, not descending, not yet breaking the boundary between observation and action. But awareness had already shifted into certainty. The world above was no longer distant. It was connected. And something within it had reached a point where connection becomes consequence. Persephone bent once more toward the flowers. And in that single, quiet gesture, something older than attention aligned itself across both worlds. Not fate, not prophecy, but inevitability forming itself in real time. The meadow remained beautiful. The sky remained open. The earth remained alive. And yet, beneath all of it, something unseen prepared to move. Not because it had chosen to, but because the moment had finally become possible. Fields that should have flourished began to wither completely. Trees that once stood in harmony with seasons became brittle. The natural rhythm of life fractured as if something essential had been removed from its foundation. The earth responded not with chaos, but with withdrawal. Life stopped trusting itself. The world had begun to refuse continuation. At that point, the balance was no longer subtle. It was breaking. And still, no explanation had been given. Until the truth surfaced, not through revelation, but through absence finally becoming undeniable. Persephone was not where she should have been. The realization did not arrive gently. It struck like structure collapsing under its own weight. Above and below, realms that had once existed in balance now stood on opposite sides of a fracture neither could ignore. In the silence that followed, even the gods understood. Something had crossed a boundary that cannot be restored without consequence. The world does not collapse all at once. It unravels in layers, quietly, until people mistake absence for coincidence. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Fields still stretched across the land. Rivers still moved through their ancient paths. Sunlight still arrived each morning with the same certainty it always had. Yet something subtle began to fail. Seeds stopped responding. Soil that once welcomed life now felt indifferent. Growth became inconsistent, as if the world had forgotten the rhythm it once obeyed without question. At the center of this disruption stood Demeter. She did not understand immediately. The change was too gradual to declare itself. Even divinity, when anchored in structure, does not always recognize imbalance until it spreads beyond repair. At first, she believed it was chance, a poor season, a temporary silence in the cycle of life. Then came the second field, then the third, then the realization that the pattern was no longer random. It was directional. Something had changed at the source. Not in the soil, not in the sky, but in the connection between them. Demeter began to search, not like a goddess performing a duty, but like something fundamental had been taken without permission. She moved across the world with increasing urgency, her presence altering the very behavior of nature around her. Where she passed, life responded, but less confidently than before, as if uncertain whether it should continue growing in her absence. The world was still alive. It was simply becoming hesitant to remain so. Meanwhile, above the awareness of mortals, a silence persisted within the divine order. Nothing had been announced. Nothing had been declared. Yet several gods already understood that imbalance does not appear without cause. Far below the surface of the world, where light no longer carried meaning, Hades remained unmoved. The underworld does not reflect change from above. It absorbs it only when it is complete. But even there, something had begun to register, not as emotion, not as intention, but as alignment shifting slightly off-center. Not enough to disrupt order, enough to acknowledge it. Above, Persephone continued to exist in the world of sunlight, unaware that her absence from attention was beginning to carry weight beyond her understanding. The meadow she once wandered now felt unchanged on the surface, but absence has a way of echoing differently when it is not immediately explained. Demeter's search became relentless. Mountains were questioned, rivers were followed, winds were appealed to as if they might confess what had happened. No answer came from the world itself, because the world does not speak when something has already moved beyond it. Eventually, even divinity begins to understand that silence is not ignorance. It is containment. And containment, once recognized, becomes unbearable. Demeter's grief did not arrive as sadness first. It arrived as distortion, below the world of breath and bloom. Time does not arrive in seasons. It settles instead, like weight without movement. In that place, Persephone no longer experienced the world as continuity. The sky had vanished. The wind no longer carried messages from distant lands. Even memory began to feel less like something she possessed, more like something she had to actively hold on to. At first, there was resistance. Confusion shaped her awareness into urgency. Questions formed faster than answers could appear. Every direction felt the same, every corridor of existence reflecting the same unchanging order. Nothing here reacted to her presence in the way the world above had. Nothing bent toward her. Nothing grew. Nothing softened. This was the first true fracture in her understanding of reality. Above her awareness, far removed from the rhythm of life she once knew, stood Hades. He did not approach her as a captor would approach something stolen, nor as a conqueror would approach a victory. His presence was consistent with the nature of his domain, measured, restrained, absolute in its refusal to pretend that things could be otherwise than they were. The underworld does not lie. It simply refuses to offer alternatives. Persephone's initial fear was not of violence. It was of permanence. Because nothing in her previous existence had prepared her for a world that does not evolve, only persists. She spoke at first with urgency, demands shaped by instinct rather than understanding, questions that expected interruption, escape, reversal. None came. Not because she was ignored, but because answers in this place do not function the way questions intend. Hades listened. Not with sympathy, not with cruelty, with recognition. He had heard every variation of loss before. Every arrival carried the same disorientation. Every presence that entered his realm believed, initially, that change was still possible. It is the first illusion the underworld removes. Change is not absent here. It is complete. Persephone moved through spaces that reflected no life she recognized. No growing thing interrupted the stillness. No cycle suggested return. Everything that existed had already completed its transformation. There was no becoming, only being. And slowly, without announcement, something in her began to adjust. Not acceptance, not understanding, but recalibration. The mind adapts when resistance ceases to produce outcome. Time in this place did not heal or wound. It accumulated without direction. Moments did not lead forward. They layered upon each other without progression. At some point, Persephone stopped expecting rescue in the form she had imagined. That realization did not arrive as surrender. It arrived as exhaustion. Meanwhile, Hades remained unchanged in posture. Yet something subtle began to register within his awareness. Not emotional transformation, but structural observation. She did not break. She did not dissolve into despair as quickly as others might have. Instead, she began to observe. The underworld was not static in the way she had first assumed. It was ordered, precise, built on rules so absolute they no longer needed enforcement. Yet within that order, she was beginning to notice something unexpected. Consistency. Not cruelty, not chaos. Consistency. And consistency, when observed long enough, becomes a form of language. Days passed, or what would have been days above. The distinction no longer held meaning here. Persephone began to walk further through the realm, not because she understood it, but because stillness without direction eventually becomes its own kind of suffocation. She learned the rhythm of silence. She learned the weight of spaces where nothing interrupts thought. Slowly, reluctantly, perception shifted. What had first felt like confinement began to resemble structure. What had felt like absence began to feel like permanence. This did not mean acceptance. It meant comprehension beginning to form where resistance had once lived. And somewhere within that transformation, Hades observed something that had not existed before. Not obedience, not submission, understanding. Not of escape, but of reality. A reality where nothing above could be reached by force of desire alone. A reality where existence does not bend to longing, only to law. And in that quiet unfolding, something unspoken began to take shape between them. Not connection in the mortal sense, but alignment of perception across two beings who exist in entirely different interpretations of permanence. The underworld remained unchanged, but perception within it no longer was. Meaning does not disappear in silence. It changes shape. In the depths of Hades' realm, silence is not emptiness. It is structure without distraction. Every space carries intention. Every absence is deliberate. Within that architecture, Persephone began to notice something unsettling. The underworld did not resist her presence. It responded to it. Not through emotion, not through warmth or hostility, through pattern. Paths she walked became familiar faster than expected. Spaces that once felt indistinguishable began to separate themselves in subtle ways. Not because they changed, but because her awareness did. Perception, in a place without decay, becomes the only evolving force. At first, she mistook this for adaptation, a survival mechanism of the mind adjusting to confinement. Yet the shift ran deeper than coping. It resembled recognition. The world below was not chaotic. It was ordered with a precision that left no room for accident. Nothing here drifted without cause. Nothing existed without defined position. Even absence had structure. That realization did not comfort her. It unsettled her in a different way. Because disorder can be resisted, structure cannot. Far from the realm of growth and grief above, the imbalance created by her disappearance continued to expand. The world she had left behind no longer responded with subtle decline. It reacted with collapse. Not sudden destruction, withdrawal. Fields that once followed the rhythm of life stopped responding entirely. Soil hardened into indifference. Seasons began to lose their boundaries, as if unsure which direction they were meant to move. At the center of this unraveling stood Demeter, whose presence once guaranteed continuity. Now, her presence only revealed absence. Grief had stopped behaving like emotion. It had become environmental force. Back below, awareness shifted again. Hades did not intervene in Persephone's understanding. Intervention would imply instability in what was already absolute. Instead, he observed the transformation taking place within her perception. She was no longer reacting to the underworld as an intruder. She was beginning to interpret it. That distinction mattered, because interpretation is the first step toward integration. Persephone did not notice when her fear stopped escalating. There was no single moment where it ended. It simply failed to continue growing. In its place, attention expanded. She began to notice patterns in silence she had previously assumed were absence. The way certain spaces carried weight, the way distance here did not imply escape, but transition between defined states. Nothing in this realm was random. Even stillness had purpose. This realization did not soften her experience. It sharpened it, because understanding a system does not make it less binding. It only makes it legible. Meanwhile, Hades observed something unexpected forming within that clarity. Not submission, not despair, comprehension without collapse. The underworld had never produced this exact response before. Most who arrived either resisted until broken or surrendered into numb acceptance. Persephone did neither. She adapted without dissolving. She questioned without rebellion. She began to exist within structure rather than against it. And structure, when acknowledged fully, begins to feel less like imprisonment and more like law. Far above, the world still unraveled in silence. But beneath it, something more subtle was occurring. Not escape, not resolution, a shift in perception between two beings who, for the first time, were beginning to recognize the same reality from different positions within it. No agreement had been made. No bond had been declared. Yet something between order and awareness had begun to stabilize. And in the underworld, stability is never accidental. It is the beginning of permanence taking form. Certain laws in existence are not spoken. They are inherited. In the world beneath the living, those laws hold absolute weight. Nothing in the realm of Hades exists without consequence already embedded within it. Every object, every space, every offering carries meaning that cannot be separated from its function. It is not a place of choices. It is a place of bindings. At first, Persephone did not recognize the significance of what she was given. Small, dark seeds, simple in appearance, ordinary in form. Yet nothing in this realm is ever only what it appears to be. The offering was not delivered with force. No command accompanied it. No explanation framed it as demand. It arrived instead as part of the underworld's natural logic, where nourishment is never separate from attachment. She hesitated. Not out of fear, out of instinct that something in this moment carried weight beyond its simplicity. To consume is to accept. To accept is to remain. That understanding surfaced before language could fully shape it. Above, the world she came from continued its slow collapse. The absence of her presence had become structural failure. Fields no longer responded to care. Seasons drifted without rhythm. The grief of Demeter had become indistinguishable from environmental law. Life itself was refusing to proceed. Yet here, in this still domain, existence remained intact, not flourishing, not decaying, simply continuing. Persephone took the seeds. There was no celebration in the moment. No tragedy either. Only decision. And decisions, once made in places governed by permanence, do not behave like those made in the world above. They do not dissolve. They define. The act itself was small. Its consequence was not. In that instant, something fundamental shifted, not visibly, not violently, but irreversibly. The structure of her existence aligned with a rule older than emotion, older than resistance, older than desire. Nothing that belongs to the underworld can remain untouched by it. Above, the imbalance reached its limit. The earth no longer withheld change. It expressed it fully. What had begun as absence became transformation of the entire natural order. Life retreated into uncertainty. Growth became intermittent, as if the world itself had begun dividing its attention between presence and absence. Demeter's grief sharpened into something beyond mourning. It became demand without negotiation. Truth had to be revealed, not requested, not hoped for, demanded. Far below, Hades understood the moment without witnessing it directly. Not through sight, through consequence. The law had been completed. The binding was active. Persephone was no longer entirely separate from this realm, nor entirely belonging to the one above. The underworld does not undo what has been integrated into its structure. It only acknowledges permanence. Persephone did not yet fully understand what had changed. Only that something had closed behind her without sound. A threshold crossed not in movement, but in definition. And once defined, cannot be redefined. Hades did not speak. There was no need, because in this place, truth does not require explanation, only recognition. And somewhere above, where grief had finally become unbearable in its silence, forces far older than individual will began to move toward resolution. Not to undo what had been done, but to determine what it now meant. When balance breaks in the mortal world, it is felt as famine, silence, and fear. When balance breaks among gods, it is felt as inevitability gathering shape. At Olympus, the question was no longer what happened. It was what now exists because of it. The absence of Persephone had stopped being a mystery and become a condition affecting all realms connected to life above ground. Fields no longer failed randomly. They failed consistently. Seasons no longer drifted. They fractured. Even the passage of time above the earth had begun to lose coherence. At the center of this unraveling stood Demeter, whose grief had stopped being personal. It had become structural force. Wherever she refused growth, growth ceased. Wherever she withdrew attention, life followed. The world was no longer suffering loss. It was reflecting it. And so the gods were forced into alignment, not by persuasion, by necessity. Zeus did not summon the council as a gesture of diplomacy. He did so because imbalance, once large enough, stops being negotiable. It becomes systemic failure. The underworld had not violated law. That was the problem. It had acted within it, below all deliberation, beneath every argument that would be made. One truth remained unchanged. Persephone had crossed into a realm governed by permanence. And permanence does not release what it has already absorbed without equivalent exchange. The gods spoke, but their words carried a different weight than before. Not accusation, not judgment, calculation layered over consequence. What has been taken? What can be returned? What must remain divided? These were no longer emotional questions. They were structural ones, far below their deliberation, in a realm where decisions above arrive only as echoes. Hades remained unmoved, not resistant, not defiant, simply aligned with the nature of what had already occurred. Persephone stood within the underworld, aware now that something beyond her immediate perception was shifting. Not because she could hear it, but because reality itself had begun to feel divided. Two worlds no longer connected by flow, but by tension. Above, Demeter's refusal to continue the cycle of life had reached its limit. The earth could not sustain her absence indefinitely. Neither could it restore itself without resolving the cause of imbalance. The gods understood what this meant. Restoration was no longer simple return. It was negotiation between domains that do not share the same definition of existence. Zeus spoke at last, not with anger, not with urgency, with finality shaped into structure. The resolution was not framed as victory or loss. Those terms no longer applied. Instead, it was defined as division made lawful. Persephone would not be fully returned, nor fully retained. She would exist between worlds, above for part of the cycle, below for the rest. A binding that does not undo separation, but formalizes it. In that decision, nothing was restored to its original state. Instead, balance was reconfigured, not healed, rewritten. Below, Hades did not react, because nothing in this outcome contradicted the nature of his domain. Above, Demeter did not accept, because nothing in this outcome restored what she had lost. Persephone, caught between both realms, understood only one thing with clarity. Her existence was no longer singular. It had become divided law. And once law is established between worlds, it does not bend toward desire. It continues indefinitely. The world does not celebrate balance when it arrives. It only recognizes that collapse has paused. Above the earth, silence lifted in fragments rather than rupture. Fields that had long forgotten growth began to respond again, slowly at first, uncertain, like memory returning after a long absence. Soil softened, rivers regained direction. Light no longer felt like it was passing over a dead surface. Life resumed, but cautiously, as though it no longer fully trusted its own continuity. At the center of this renewal stood Demeter. Her grief had not disappeared. It had been constrained, not healed, not resolved, contained within structure now imposed by forces beyond emotion. The earth did not flourish because sorrow ended. It flourished because sorrow was no longer absolute. Below, in the still domain of Hades, nothing changed outwardly. Change does not exist here in the way it does above. Only presence shifts between defined states. Within that structure, Persephone moved between two realities that no longer pretended to be one. Her return was not reversal. It was rhythm. When she ascended, the world above did not greet her as if she had been restored. It responded instead as something recognizing a necessary return. Flowers opened not in celebration, but in alignment. Growth resumed not because joy demanded it, but because absence had reached its permitted duration. When she descended, the world below did not reject her. It stabilized around her presence, as though confirming a law that had always been true but now fully defined. She no longer belonged to one existence. She belonged to both. And that belonging was not conflict. It was structure. The first cycle passed without collapse. Then another. Then another. Over time, what once felt like fracture began to feel like rhythm. Above, Persephone was no longer only daughter of Demeter. She had become part of the mechanism through which life and absence were balanced. Below, she was no longer only presence within the underworld. She had become part of its continuity, something that acknowledged both arrival and departure as natural states of existence. Hades observed this without need for change. Not because he lacked feeling, because feeling is not required where understanding is complete. The underworld had not been altered. It had been extended. A cycle now connected what once stood apart. Life above no longer existed in isolation from death below. Death no longer existed as separation from life. Both had become parts of a single structure expressed in two alternating states. Far above, mortals named it without understanding it fully. They called it seasons. Spring when Persephone returned. Autumn when she descended. Summer in her presence above. Winter in her absence. But beneath naming, the truth remained simpler. Nothing was restored to what it was before. Everything had become what it would always be now. Balanced not through unity, but through repetition. Persephone stood at the threshold between worlds one final time in awareness, though not in conflict. There was no longer a need to choose, only to continue. Below, silence held its usual form. Above, light moved through living fields. Between them, a cycle existed that neither realm controlled, yet both now sustained. And in that cycle, myth no longer told a story of loss or rescue. It told the quieter truth that some separations are not meant to end, only to repeat, forever in motion, forever in balance.